Hi everyone, this is Mr. Moreau with a quick tutorial on the human heart and the flow of blood through our circulatory system. First, I thought we'd start with the chambers of the human heart. Now, as you can see, this cross-section of the human heart shows us that there's very clearly 4 separate chambers of the heart. And I'll circle them here so that we can see those 4 sections that are almost like different compartments. Now on our left side, which is this person's right side, that would be the right atrium and the right ventricle. So now you've been introduced to some new terms. Atrium means one of the chambers on top, and the ventricle means one of the chambers on the bottom. Then, of course, on the other side, our right side, but this person's left side, would be the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, those different chambers allow us to understand that blood travels through the heart in a certain sequence, and that sequence is better understood when we go through some of the blood vessels. Now, blood returning from the body to the heart is very low in oxygen because our body muscles have used up all of that oxygen. In this picture, blood returning from the body, which is low in oxygen, is visualized with the color blue. So, blood returning from the body goes through this blood vessel, which is the superior vena cava, and this blood vessel, the inferior vena cava. Now, from the upper and lower body, blood returns through the superior and inferior vena cava and enters the right atrium. From that point, it travels through this valve. Now, this valve is called the tricuspid valve, and it ensures that blood flows in only one direction. When the muscles that surround the heart contract or squeeze, blood is pushed from the right atrium into the right ventricle. The direction in which those valve muscles appear to point ensures that blood only travels in one direction. Later on, when the muscles around the right ventricle contract, blood is pushed through this valve, which is called the pulmonary valve. Blood travels through this blood vessel, and this blood vessel splits like a fork in the road, which actually goes to the lungs. Now, when that blood goes to the right and left lungs, you can imagine that that blood, which is visualized in this picture as blue, low in oxygen, gets replenished with a high supply of oxygen. We will in the near future cover how that blood gets reoxygenated in the lungs. For now, let's understand that the blood that goes from the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery, that's the name of this blood vessel, when it goes to the lungs, it gets resupplied with oxygen and then returns to the heart through these blood vessels here. These are called the pulmonary veins. Now, on our left side, that's a bit difficult to visualize. So what I'd like you to imagine is that although it's difficult to see, these blood vessels on the left actually follow all the way behind a lot of what you see here to empty into the left ventricle through those holes that you can see. And the same thing happens on the left side, which is our right side, as we're viewing this picture. Okay, now that this oxygen-rich blood has returned to the heart, it is emptied into the left atrium. Then the blood is again pushed through another valve, and that is called the bicuspid valve, sometimes also referred to as the mitral valve, and the blood goes from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Later, when the muscles around the left ventricle squeeze, that blood is then pushed through this valve into this blood vessel here, out any of these 3 outlets, even around back, and that blood vessel travels all the way around back around the heart. That very large red blood vessel on the top of the heart that we've seen is called the aorta. That is actually our largest blood vessel, and that is the blood vessel through which blood travels to reach the entire body. So the pressure with which blood is pushed from the left ventricle through the entire body is quite substantial. there's a lot of pressure that allows the blood to be pushed from the left ventricle to the entire body. Eventually, the body will receive that blood, use the oxygen that is in that blood, and that oxygen is eventually used up, and therefore the blood in our body is then depleted of oxygen. Eventually, it will return to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava, and the entire cycle starts again. So that's all about the flow of blood through our heart and the body. What I'm going to do next is describe how actually that pumping of the blood is accomplished. So I'm going to get rid of what I've done here and show you that there is actually a special region of cells right in this region here, and that is called the Sinoatrial Node. That is a special region of cells that is actually able to generate electrical impulses. And those electrical impulses are picked up by neighboring cells such that it's almost like an electrical signal that sends out a message for muscles to contract. There is another node right in this region here, right down the middle of the heart. And that is called the AV, or atrioventricular node. The reason why it's called atrioventricular is because it lies just between the atria, the chambers on top of the heart, and the ventricles, the chambers on the bottom of the heart. So the atrioventricular node receives those electrical impulse signals and relays them down through this center muscle and around these to initiate another round of contraction. So what you'd actually get is the sinoatrial node initiating that muscular contraction, and the AV node slightly later receiving and relaying another round of electrical stimulation, which would cause more muscle contraction. So what that would result in is sort of a rhythmic bum bum, bum bum, bum bum. And that is really what causes the heartbeat. Okay, so the sinoatrial node beginning that first round of muscular contraction, and the AV node accomplishing that very slightly delayed second round of muscular contraction. So that's what gives us our actual heartbeat. Okay, so really the atria contracting followed by the ventricles contracting, which would cause the valves we see here opening and closing, which is actually what a doctor is able to hear when they listen to your heart using a stethoscope. So the sounds that they're listening for are actually the opening and closing of the valves. That is what's able to make a noise, and that is made possible because of the electrical impulses from the SA node and the AV node. So our heartbeat is what actually causes the muscles in the heart to contract, which allows blood to be pushed through the heart, through the various chambers, all the way through our body and to the lungs and back to accomplish what is so necessary for our circulatory system, to move blood through our body and to the lungs in order to supply our body with a good amount of oxygen that it so desperately needs. The last item I'd like to discuss with you is something that lies just beyond the picture of the human heart that we saw above. Now, our blood vessels, or the tubes through which blood travels, are very important to understand because there's different degrees or different levels of those blood vessels. Now, any blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart, we call that an artery. However, we have so many cells, our circulatory system really branches almost like a tree. Imagine a tree trunk branching into smaller branches and smaller twigs and so on until you get to the very distant leaves and buds and so on. Well, that's very similar to how the blood vessels work in the human body. We have a few thick arteries that lead from the heart, but those branch into smaller blood vessels. So the arteries are those large blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart that eventually branch into smaller tubes, which we call arterioles. Eventually, those arterioles branch into the smallest blood vessels that we have, which at some points are even only one blood cell wide. They are so thin that blood cells need to flow through them single file. That's how skinny these blood vessels are. Those are called our capillaries. Now, our capillaries actually reach every single one of our cells, so that is how extensive the branching of our capillaries really is. Now, eventually we need to make the return trip. Okay, the blood that leaves the heart and reaches our body cells eventually needs to kind of loop around and head back to the heart. So capillaries start to merge back together to form slightly larger blood vessels that are returning to the heart, and those are called venules. Venules merge back together to form the largest blood vessels that return to the heart, such as the superior and inferior vena cava, and we call those large blood vessels that return to the heart our veins. Now, if we want to visualize what these look like, it would be something like this. I've got a picture here that shows us an arteriole and a venule. Now, an arteriole is heading in one direction. That blood is shown to be red, which means that it is high in oxygen, so it is heading from the heart to the body. The body will eventually use up the oxygen that is in that oxygen-rich blood, and the blood returns to the body through the venules. And you can see in this picture, the blood in the venules is shown to be blue, which is just meant to represent blood that is low in oxygen by comparison. Now, just to set the scale of this picture, I'm going to highlight a few things here. This, or this, or this. These are individual cells, for example, muscle cells in our body. Now, that shows you just how tiny those capillaries are. Those capillaries are so thin that really only one blood cell can fit through them, so the blood cells really have to go through single file. And you can see how extensive the capillary branching must be, such that the capillaries really touch or come in contact with every single cell that we have. That ensures that every single one of our cells does receive a constant supply of oxygen from our blood. Like I said before, we will talk more extensively about how the blood gets its oxygen supply constantly, so there must be a very important connection between the circulatory system, which is our blood system, and the respiratory system. So how we get oxygen into our blood is our next topic, but for now, that's it for today for the circulatory system. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.